And I understand that there are exemptions out there, Mrs. Murphy exemptions and things of that nature. But honestly, if you're landlording, in my opinion, set all of that aside. Don't worry about exemptions. Don't worry about how you can get around the rules. Look at what the rules are and understand how to operate inside the rules, because ultimately that's going to put you in a much more protected position.
All right, guys, if you're just joining us, I'm hanging out here with Andrew Schultz, who is a property manager and a real estate broker out of Buffalo, New York. And Andrew, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about during our conversation here on this show and podcast is tenant screening. As you know, one of the biggest challenges, especially the mom and pop landlords have out there, is selecting the right tenants and avoiding the disasters that could result from selecting the wrong tenant. So one of the things that comes up a lot, I'm asked about this a lot, as well as you see it in the forums, you see it online, people are constantly asking about this, is what criteria should I be setting for my tenant screening and for my applicants in order to get those good tenants that I want and kind of weed out the bad ones?
Ultimately, I think that your tenant screening criteria is going to be somewhat market dependent. For instance, here in Buffalo, we run with a 600 credit score. But if you have a higher end rental, you might not want somebody with that low of a credit score. You may want to bump it to 650 or 700 or things of that nature. But one of the most important things is making sure that whatever criteria that you are using are, number one, written so that you have something to refer back to as you're screening applicants. And number two, fair housing compliant. And that's probably the more critical part of it, is making sure that everything that you're doing is fair housing compliant. And I understand that there are exemptions out there, Mrs. Murphy exemptions and things of that nature. But honestly, if you're landlording, in my opinion, set all of that aside. Don't worry about exemptions. Don't worry about how you can get around the rules. Look at what the rules are and understand how to operate inside the rules, because ultimately that's going to put you in a much more protected position. So in terms of actually like selecting criteria and things of that nature, I think it starts with, even before you list the apartment, understanding what your market is and what are other landlords in the area using for their criteria. Are there other landlords that are using criteria? There are a lot of people that'll just accept the first person with a pulse and a paycheck. So having that set of written criteria, making sure that the criteria is fair housing compliant, and following that same criteria every single time keeps you out of hot water as a landlord. So it's worth pointing out that on the Rent Prep website, there are a ton of resources on finding out how to go about screening tenants and selecting your criteria and things of that nature. From the Rent Prep website, if you go under tenant screening and hit tenant screening 101, there is a massive guide here on things that you can do to help you select the right tenant. The one thing that I want to go into is forming tenant screening criteria. Let me scroll down here. So this kind of goes through how to use or how to select different criteria that are compliant and criteria that are not compliant. There's also a little YouTube video here that you can use.
Nice.
But even more than this, I want to point out the 20 questions to ask potential tenants. Because on this list, this is like a pre-screening list. This would be questions that you might want to ask a renter before they come out to take a look at an apartment. And the one thing that a lot of people ask is, how many people will be living with you? And this is one of the easiest fair housing traps to fall into. This question needs to be asked very, very specifically. You cannot ask how many adults and how many children. That is a fair housing violation. Straight up, that's a fair housing violation. You have to ask how many people will be living with you if you ask this question at all. More often than not, people will volunteer, oh, it's going to be myself and my wife and my 3 kids, or it's going to be me and my girlfriend, or it's going to be me and my roommate, or whatever the case may be. But you cannot ask how many adults, how many children. That is a fair housing violation straight up. So that is one question that I wanted to specifically point out on here, that when you're forming these questions, something as simple as using the wrong language when you ask a question, oh, how many kids do you have? Versus, oh, how many people are going to be living in the home? That's the violation. And I believe here fair housing violations start at 10 grand a pop. So they're not cheap. So if you are in a situation where you're trying to set your criteria for the first time, you're flying blind, you're not sure what to do, I would definitely recommend coming over to this website and going through, learning more about how to pick good criteria, learning more about how to pick criteria that are fair housing compliant, and how to actually get that criteria into a written format so that you know that you're using that same criteria each and every time that you screen a tenant.